The sound of silverware clinking against fine china faded into a suffocating silence. I stood up so fast my chair screeched across the marble floor, tipping slightly behind me. Every face in the room turned. Laughter halted mid-chuckle. The lighting, warm and golden just seconds ago, now felt like a spotlight, harsh and unrelenting. My hands were shaking, but I didn't care. They've just mocked her. My mom, Maria, the woman who co-signed a loan for the people, who was sitting smugly in front of me, who bailed out their restaurant when no bank would touch them, who paid for their oven, for their renovations, for their son's last semester in college. The woman who made sacrifices for others with zero expectations in return, and now they called her a meddler? A burden? Let's hope Jason doesn't inherit Maria's enthusiasm for taking over, Robert had said into the mic, swirling his wine like a late-night talk show guest. Laughter erupted. And Lydia, my fiancée, my supposed partner in life, laughed the loudest. I looked straight at her and she didn't flinch. She thought it was funny. Are you all serious right now? My voice cracked slightly as I said it. You could have heard a pin drop. Eleanor, Lydia's mother, smiled that fake socialite smile and said, Jason, sweetheart, don't be so sensitive. It's just a little humor. You know how Maria always liked to be involved. No, I said, voice steadier now. Maria gave more to this family than most blood relatives ever would, and you repay her with this mockery? At our rehearsal dinner? My breath was coming in short, angry bursts. My eyes scanned the room. Chandeliers glittering overhead, waitstaff frozen by the walls, Lydia's extended family staring like I'd grown horns. On my side, just my dad, my sister, and 2 friends from back home, the people who knew the real Maria. You laughed. I turned back to Lydia. You didn't flinch. You didn't stop them. You laughed. That's all I need to know. She blinked, suddenly pale. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just said it, clear and final, this wedding is off. People gasped, someone dropped a fork. My dad stood up, hands clenched at his sides, but he didn't move. He knew this was mine to do. I won't marry into a family that disrespects the dead, especially the only person who ever truly had my back. And with that, I walked out, past the stunned guests, past Lydia's stunned face, and into the night air. Cold, biting, and real. Behind me, a life I'd almost settled for. Ahead, honestly, I had no idea. But for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. My name's Jason Carter. I'm 33, born and raised in a small steel town in Pennsylvania, where folks know your name, your business, and whether your front porch light's been on too long. I wasn't born into much, but what I had was solid. A mother who worked 2 jobs but never missed a school play, a father who taught me how to hold a wrench and hold my tongue, and a sister who could out-talk a preacher and out-punch any bully who looked at me funny. We weren't flashy, we weren't rich, but we loved hard and we showed up. My mom Maria was the heart of all that. She wasn't loud, but she didn't need to be. You felt her presence by the way your fridge mysteriously filled after a layoff, or how your laundry got done when your back went out. She didn't do it for thanks. She did it because that's what love meant to her, showing up quietly and completely. When I was 16, she worked night shifts at the hospital just to save enough for me and my sister to go to college. And when my dad got laid off from the mill, she picked up a cleaning job without blinking. We don't quit, she told me once. We adjust. That line stuck with me. Through the cheap apartments, ramen noodle dinners, and all-nighters in college, it became my mantra. We don't quit, we adjust. It was that mindset that helped me build my career. After college, I landed a job in construction management, started small, residential builds and school renovations. But I worked hard, took the crap jobs nobody wanted, and learned everything I could. 5 years later, I had my crew, my contracts, and enough saved to finally think about building a life, not just surviving one. That's when I met Lydia. We met at a backyard cookout hosted by a mutual friend. She showed up in a red sundress, laughing like she owned the sun, and I was a goner before dessert. She was charming, quick with a joke, and different. She came from money, like a trust fund, legacy, university kind of money. But she never made it a thing, at least not at first. She said she liked that I was grounded, that I didn't put on a show. I believed her. For a long time, I believed her. When I introduced her to my family, my mom immediately smiled and said, "She's got fire in her eyes. Keep up or she'll leave you in the dust." They seemed to get along okay, at least on the surface. But over time, Lydia started making little comments. "Your mom's a little much sometimes, huh? She calls a lot. Doesn't she have hobbies? He doesn't let people help her, does she?" I brushed it off. She didn't mean harm, I thought. She's just adjusting like we all do. But looking back, those weren't just offhand comments. They were red flags, waving right in my face. Still, I was in love. I wanted it to work. When I proposed on one knee at the Overlook where we had our first real date, I wasn't just asking her to be my wife. I was asking her to be part of the family that raised me. That meant my mom, my dad, my sister, and all the unspoken values we lived by. She said yes, with tears in her eyes. But somewhere between that yes and the night I walked out of our rehearsal dinner, things shifted. Or maybe I just started seeing clearly. The woman I loved had slowly stopped being my partner and started being someone else entirely. And her family, they'd never even tried to pretend. They saw me as a charity case, an upgrade for Lydia's image of humble roots. As still, I stayed, because that's what I'd been taught. You work through the rough spots, you adjust. But the thing is, even a man who doesn't quit has a line. And they crossed it the night they laughed at my mother's memory. Looking back, the red flags were everywhere, but love has a way of painting even the ugliest warning signs in soft pastels. It started subtly, like a slow leak under the floorboards. At first, it's just a damp patch. Then the rot sets in. 3 months after the engagement, Lydia and I started wedding planning. I was excited. I had always imagined a simple ceremony, backyard fairy lights, a barbecue-style reception, but Lydia had other ideas. "No offense, babe," she said one night while flipping through bridal magazines, "but we're not doing folding chairs and pulled pork. This is our big day. It should feel elevated." Elevated meant chandeliers, a country club venue, signature cocktails, and a 10-piece jazz band. I adjusted. I told myself it didn't matter, that what mattered was marrying her. Then came the guest list. "Do we have to invite your Uncle Ray?" she asked. "He drinks too much. He helped raise me when Dad was working double shifts." She rolled her eyes. "Just think of the aesthetic." I remember staring at her at that moment, wondering when the woman I fell in love with started caring more about aesthetics than people. But I stayed quiet, because that's what I did. The turning point came when I asked if we could include a small tribute to my mom during the ceremony, maybe a photo at the entrance or a short mention during the vows, just something to acknowledge the woman who had shaped so much of who I was. Lydia pursed her lips. "I just don't want the mood to be sad. This is supposed to be a celebration, not a memorial." I nodded slowly, but my stomach turned. That wasn't about mood. That was erasing her. Erasing the woman who once paid Lydia's brother's tuition out of her pocket. Then there were the dinners with Lydia's parents, Robert and Eleanor. At first, I thought they were just eccentric, upper-class types who didn't know how to connect with people like me. But it became clear to us that they didn't want to. Robert would say things like, "Lydia's always had good taste. She's marrying a man who can fix things and hold a conversation." On the surface, a compliment. Underneath, a reminder. I wasn't one of them. I was the blue-collar boy who'd lucked into their polished world. Eleanor was worse, passive-aggressive, masked in pearls and practiced smiles. Maria always had such strong opinions. I suppose that's where you get your stubborn streak. I smiled. I always smiled, for Lydia's sake. but inside I was starting to rot. Then, about 6 weeks before the wedding, they insisted on hosting the rehearsal dinner. Our treat, they said, like it was some royal decree. I was skeptical, but Lydia was thrilled. It'll be amazing, babe. They have this connection with a restaurant downtown, super exclusive. Exclusive. That was the word they loved. Exclusive people, exclusive events, exclusive everything. As we got closer to the dinner, the cracks became chasms. I wasn't allowed to pick the menu. My family barely made the guest list. When I brought it up, Lydia said, "Your side's pretty small, babe. My parents had to fill the room somehow." I stared at her. "You mean with business associates?" She shrugged. "It's not a big deal." Everything was not a big deal. I tried to ignore the gut punches, tried to tell myself it was just wedding stress, but something shifted the night we went to her parents' house to finalize the seating chart. Eleanor was in full event planner mode, barking orders at a poor assistant who looked like she'd rather be in traffic. I suggested we change the centerpieces to something simpler, wildflowers, like the ones my mom used to grow. Eleanor didn't even look up. Maria had interesting taste, but this is Lydia's day, dear. Let's keep it modern. I froze. Lydia didn't say a word. She just kept scrolling through her phone. I left that night with a pit in my stomach and a question I didn't want to ask. If this was how they treated my mother in death, how would they treat me in life? But I still didn't walk away because part of me believed that once the wedding was over, things would settle. That maybe, just maybe, Lydia would come back to the woman I fell in love with. Turns out some people don't come back. They just keep going farther and farther from who you thought they were. The night of the rehearsal dinner arrived like a storm you know is coming, but still, hope will miss you. Lydia and I rode together to the restaurant, but we barely spoke. She was glued to her phone, swiping through messages, occasionally typing something out with a small, unreadable smile. "You excited?" I asked, trying to break the silence. She didn't even look up. "It's just dinner, Jason. Don't overthink it. Just dinner." Right. The venue was exactly what I expected. All white marble floors, glimmering chandeliers, and a grand piano in the corner that nobody was playing. It didn't feel like us. Hell, it didn't even feel like her. It felt like Robert and Eleanor. It screamed, "Look how important we are." When we walked in, they were already working the room, shaking hands, air kissing, name dropping. It looked more like a campaign fundraiser than a family gathering. Then I noticed the guest list. My dad was there along with my sister and 2 childhood friends. That was it. Everyone else, Lydia's relatives, her parents, business partners, people I'd never seen before and would probably never see again. I pulled Lydia aside. "Where's everyone from my side?" I asked. She rolled her eyes. "Jason, your family is small. My parents had to fill the space. Don't make this a thing." I bit my tongue. Again, I was getting good at that. Dinner began. Courses came and went. Lobster risotto, duck confit, some tiny thing wrapped in seaweed and arrogance. I barely tasted any of it. Then came the speeches. Robert stood, holding a wine glass like it was a TED Talk clicker. He cleared his throat, smiling like a man about to deliver the line of the century. "Tonight," he began, "is about celebrating the union of 2 families, our daughter Lydia and Jason." The pause before my name was a punch to the chest. He launched into a speech about Lydia's childhood achievements, her leadership skills, and how she always knew what she wanted. "She's always been a star," he said, "and now she's marrying someone who will help keep her grounded." Laughter. Smarks. I gripped my water glass like it was a lifeline. And Robert said, "We always taught Lydia to aim high. And while Jason might not be what we envisioned at first," he, he let it hang there. I felt my face flush. I glanced at my dad, who was staring daggers. My sister had stopped eating entirely, her fork frozen midair. Eleanor was next. He strutted to the mic like she was accepting an award. She gushed about Lydia, how she was patient, kind, the perfect daughter. Then she looked at me. Jason's been learning so much from her, she said with a smile, and it's been lovely watching him grow. Not everyone's used to our world, but he's adjusting. I almost choked. She wasn't done. We're so happy to welcome Jason into the family. It'll be nice having someone who doesn't mind getting their hands dirty. Another round of chuckles, another slap in the face. I looked at Lydia. She was smiling, and Robert clinked his glass again. Last thing, he said, let's not forget someone who isn't here tonight. Jason's mother, Maria. For a second, I dared to hope. She was certainly one of a kind, Robert said, grinning. Always had something to say, didn't she? Eleanor joined in. Oh yes, remember how she'd offer help even when no one asked? More laughter, more nodding, like they were sharing a fond joke, not dismantling the memory of the most important person in my life. Robert finished with, let's hope Jason doesn't inherit that enthusiasm. We wouldn't want him meddling too much, right? The room went silent. Dead, heavy, silent. Lydia? She chuckled lightly as if to say, oh, Dad, you're so bad. That's when something inside me cracked. Bent, cracked. My hands were trembling, but I stood up slowly, pushing my chair back with a screech that turned every head in the room. Eyes widened, forks froze, whispers started. Donna approached the table with a fake smile. Jason, she said sweetly, I hope you weren't offended. It was just a little humor. I turned to her, voice low, teeth clenched. Just humor? Her smile faltered. I turned to the room. You want humor? Here's a joke. A woman gives everything she has, her time, her money, her heart, to a family she barely knows, and when she dies, that same family turns her into a punchline. Gasped. I locked eyes with Lydia. You didn't stop them. You laughed, and that tells me all I need to know. Her face drained of color. Jason, wait. No, I said. You let them humiliate her, and you let them humiliate me. The weight of every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment I'd swallowed my pride, it all came flooding back in a wave so strong, it nearly knocked the wind out of me. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't the start of our life together. This was the end. The night of the rehearsal dinner was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it felt like the grand finale of a long, slow betrayal. Lydia and I barely exchanged 10 words in the car on the way to the venue. She was scrolling through her phone, tapping out replies to God knows who, while I sat beside her, trying not to drown in my unease. I'd had this growing pressure in my chest for weeks, like a balloon slowly expanding, waiting to burst. This night would be the pin. The restaurant her parents had chosen was the kind of place where the cheapest wine was a week's salary, and every course came with a story from the chef. Marble floors, candle-lit tables, waiters in tuxedos. It screamed money, status, and exclusivity. Everything Robert and Eleanor valued. They were already there when we arrived. Eleanor was directing the staff like a general, pointing at napkin placements and checking lighting angles. Robert stood near the entrance, shaking hands like a politician. Jason, he said when he saw me, clapping a hand on my shoulder. Big night, huh? Try not to spill anything. He laughed like it was a joke. I forced a smile. The first thing I noticed was the crowd. Lydia's family filled every corner of the room. Aunts, uncles, distant cousins, business associates, my family, my dad, my sister Rachel, and 2 friends from college. 5 people, total. I asked Lydia quietly, where's the rest of my list? She sighed. Jason, we talked about this. Your side is small. My parents had to fill seats. Fill them with who? I gestured toward a man in a tailored suit chatting with a woman wearing pearls the size of grapes. These people don't even know us. They're important to my parents, she said flatly. Don't make this a thing. Don't make this a thing. That was her new phrase for every boundary I tried to defend. Dinner started. The courses were served like exhibits, tiny, beautiful, tasteless. I pushed food around my plate, barely touching it. My dad whispered, "Want to hit a diner after this?" I smiled. I might take you up on that. Then came the speeches. Robert stood first, raising his glass like a CEO addressing shareholders. He began with praise for Lydia, how she was a driven, brilliant woman who always knew her worth. Then came the dig. She's marrying someone who will help keep her grounded. Pause, smirk, a few polite chuckles, then this. We always encouraged Lydia to aim high, and while Jason might not have been what we envisioned at first, we let it hang. Laughter again, muted but real. I froze, trying to hold my expression. My sister looked at me like she was ready to lunge across the table. Eleanor followed, gushing about Lydia's accomplishments, then shifting to me. It's been so nice watching Jason grow into our world, she said. He's learning quickly. Lydia's been patient. He wasn't done. And now we get to have someone in the family who knows how to work with his hands. Every family needs that balance, right? Laughter again. I stared at my plate. Then Robert raised his glass again. Before we wrap up, I'd like to acknowledge someone who isn't here tonight. Jason's mother, Maria. For a second, my heart softened. He continued, she certainly had a presence, always liked to jump in and take charge, even when no one asked. Eleanor chimed in, oh yes, she never met a boundary she didn't bulldoze, but she meant well. They laughed. Lydia laughed, and something inside me shattered. They weren't just talking about my mom. They were rewriting her, turning her generosity into a flaw, her selflessness into overreach. The woman who paid their bills, who saved their restaurant, who helped Lydia's brother finish college. Reduced to a punchline. I stood up. The chair scraped loudly across the floor. Everyone turned. Are you serious right now? My voice was quiet, but it carried. Robert blinked. Jason, we're just sharing memories. It's all in good fun. Good fun, I said, my voice rising. You just stood up in front of a room full of people and called my mother a meddler after everything she did for you? Ellen held up her hands. Jason, please, let's not make a scene. I turned to Lydia. You left. Her smile was gone. Jason, I didn't know they were going to say, but you didn't stop them. You sat there and let them tear her down, and you laughed. The room was dead silent now. My dad was rigid in his seat, fists clenched. Rachel looked like she was about to cry. Here's the truth, I said, voice shaking. My mom helped your family when no one else would. She paid for your oven when the restaurant nearly went under. She co-signed your business loan. She took care of Ryan's kids so he could finish school. She did it all quietly without asking for a thing. And this is how you thank her? This? A public roast at her son's rehearsal dinner? Robert stood. Jason, maybe you're not ready for this kind of commitment. If you can't take a joke. This isn't about jokes, I snapped. It's about respect. Something you don't have. And neither does Lydia. Lydia flinched. Don't do this. I already did. I turned to the guests. I'm calling off the wedding. A collective gasp. A glass shattered in the back. I looked around one last time, memorizing every shocked face. Then I walked out of that restaurant and into the night, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe. The night of the rehearsal dinner was cold, the kind of early autumn chill that bites through a suit jacket and sinks into your skin. But it wasn't the temperature that made me shiver. It was something else, something deeper. We were supposed to be celebrating the beginning of a new life. Instead, I was walking into what felt like the funeral of everything I thought I believed in. Lydia sat beside me in the car, legs crossed, scrolling through her phone. I tried to make small talk. Asked if she was excited and if she thought her dress looked okay, but she brushed me off with distracted nods and vague smiles. Her eyes never left the screen. By the time we pulled up to the restaurant, I already felt like a guest at someone else's party. The place was extravagant. Crystal chandeliers, a private wine cellar is visible behind tempered glass, white glove service, the kind of place that makes you feel poor just breathing the air. Robert and Eleanor, her parents, were already inside greeting guests like royalty. Eleanor wore a silver dress that sparkled too much for the lighting. Robert had a mic in hand and the smug confidence of a man who thought money could excuse anything. I glanced around the room. Of the 70 or so guests, I recognized 5. My dad, my sister Rachel, and 3 of my closest friends from back home. Everyone else, Lydia's family, Robert's business partners, Eleanor's socialite friends, not a single person from my mom's side had made the list. Not because they weren't invited, but because, as Lydia had explained a week prior, your family's kind of scattered. My parents had to fill the space. Fill the space. Like my people were placeholders in her curated fantasy. I tried to push the thought aside and make the most of the night. After all, this was about us, about the future. But everything that followed made it clear. I was just the background character in a play written by Lydia's parents. The food was pretentious and unrecognizable, small plates with even smaller names, waiters who hovered too close and smiled too hard. And every conversation I tried to start was hijacked by a wine connoisseur or someone eager to drop the name of a board they sat on. But I endured it, because that's what I did, until the speeches started. Robert was the first to stand. He tapped his wine glass gently, then launched into a 10-minute monologue about Lydia's childhood, her achievements, her brilliance, her leadership. She's always been the shining star of our family, he said, and now she's marrying someone who can keep her grounded. Pause. A few polite chuckles. He smirked and continued, "We always taught Lydia to aim high, and while Jason might not have been our original vision," another pause, more laughter. It wasn't even thinly veiled anymore. I shifted in my seat, my jaw clenched so tight I thought it might crack. My dad looked furious. Rachel had stopped chewing her fork, frozen mid-air. Then Eleanor stood up. She walked to the mic with the flair of a woman about to deliver an Oscar acceptance speech. Her voice dripped sugar. The joy, Lydia, has always been such a joy. Elegant, graceful, determined, and patient, she added, turning toward me. So patient. Watching her teach Jason about our world has been truly heartwarming. The audience chuckled again. I stared at her, wondering if she even believed her condescension. "And now," she continued, "we get to welcome someone into our family who knows the value of hard work, someone who isn't afraid to get his hands dirty." That one line broke something in me. I wasn't a man anymore, I was a mascot, a blue-collar prop for their upper-crust show. I looked at Lydia, silently begging her to say something, anything. She smiled, and then came the final blow. Robert stood again, holding his glass like he was delivering a toast at a roast. "The last thing before we wrap this up," he said, "we'd like to take a moment to remember someone who couldn't be here. Jason's mother, Maria." My heart clenched. Maybe, just maybe, they were about to say something kind. "She was one of a kind," Robert said, "always had a strong opinion, didn't she?" Eleanor chimed in, "Oh yes, always offering help, even when it wasn't asked for." Robert nodded. "She had a way of inserting herself into everything, but hey, she meant well." Laughter again. My world stopped. My throat tightened, my vision blurred, but I didn't cry. I stood. The chair screeched loudly against the floor, turning every head in the room. Silence fell. I walked slowly toward the center of the room, my heart pounding in my ears. Donna tried to intercept me, smiling too wide. "Jason, sweetheart, we were just sharing memories. Nothing serious." "Nothing serious," I said, voice low, barely controlled. "You mocked my mother?" Robert raised a brow. "Jason, it was a joke. Don't be dramatic." "A joke," my voice rose. "You just stood there and turned the most generous woman I've ever known into a punchline." Gasps echoed around me. I turned to Lydia. "You didn't stop them," I said. "You laughed." "Jason," she started. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know." I said. "You were too busy fitting in." The dam broke. I turned to the room, voice firm now. "This wedding is off." Chairs scraped, whispers flew, someone dropped a fork. I looked at my father, his face red, fists clenched, and at Rachel, who was crying now. Maria co-signed your restaurant's loan. She paid for your son's college. She bought your oven when it broke. She gave and never asked for a thing, and you reduce her to this? Robert scoffed. Jason, if you can't take a little teasing. Teasing? I said, teasing is mispronouncing someone's name. This was character assassination. Lydia stepped forward. Jason, please. I looked her dead in the eyes. No, if you won't defend my mother, you don't deserve me. And then I turned and walked out, past the chandeliers, past the silence, past the family I never truly belonged to. And as the door closed behind me, I felt it. Relief. The night I walked out of that restaurant, I didn't go home. I couldn't. I drove. Nowhere in particular, just kept going, past downtown, past the suburbs, past the familiar roads I'd driven 1,000 times before. The city lights faded, and soon I was on a stretch of highway with nothing but darkness on either side. I pulled over at a rest stop sometime around midnight, sat there with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, staring into nothing. It should have felt empowering, righteous even. I stood up for my mother. I did what so many people are too scared to do. I walked away from something toxic. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss. It felt like mourning all over again. I had pictured that night so many times, not the disaster it became, but the version where Lydia and I would smile across the table, where my dad would make a corny toast, where Rachel would sneak champagne under the table, where we'd honor my mom, maybe with a quiet moment or a simple candle. Instead, I was parked on the side of a highway, exhausted and empty. When I finally made it home, the apartment felt different, cold, hollow. The wedding planning board Lydia had hung up was still there. Dates, color swatches, venue photos. I stared at it for a long time. Then I ripped it down. I went to the small wooden box on my bookshelf, my mom's keepsake box. Inside were the only things I had left of her: a pair of earrings she wore to church, a faded Polaroid of her and me on my first day of kindergarten, a note she once left in my lunchbox, and the locket. Or at least that's what should have been there. The locket was gone. I tore the box apart, checked under the shelf, in drawers, and under furniture. Nothing. My breath caught in my throat. No one had been in my apartment since Lydia came by to return the engagement ring. She'd asked to use the bathroom. I'd left her alone for maybe 5 minutes. My stomach dropped. I texted her, hands shaking, "Did you take the locket from my mom's box?" A few minutes later, she replied, "What are you talking about?" I didn't buy it, not for a second. You know exactly what I'm talking about. That locket's been in my family for generations. Her response came 5 minutes later. "I borrowed it. I just wanted something of hers, to feel close to you." Borrowed. I called her immediately. She answered on the second ring, her voice defensive. "Jason, I was going to give it back. It's not a big deal." "Not a big deal?" I shouted. "That locket is the last thing I have from her. You took it without asking. That's stealing, Lydia." She started to cry. "I didn't think you'd notice." "That makes it worse." Silence. "Where is it?" I demanded. "At my parents' house," she said finally. I thought it would be safe there." I hung up without another word. The next day, I drove to Robert and Eleanor's house. My fist clenched the steering wheel the entire way. Eleanor opened the door, her polished smile vanishing the moment she saw me. "Jason, where is it?" I snapped. Lydia appeared behind her, holding the locket. She looked like hell, red eyes, smudged mascara, but I didn't care. She held it out like it was nothing. I snatched it, checked to make sure it was the real one, then turned to leave. "Jason, please," she called after me. I stopped, looked over my shoulder. "You mocked my mother, then you stole from her. We're done, Lydia. You don't get to play the grieving fiancé when you never respected the woman who raised me." He broke down, but I didn't turn back. I got in my truck and drove home. I locked the locket away. And that night, for the first time since she died, I let myself cry, not for the wedding, not for Lydia, but for my mom, for everything she was, for everything she deserved, and for the realization that somehow I'd let people like them rewrite her story. But not anymore. The following days passed like fog, thick, slow, disorienting. I went to work but barely spoke. I answered my dad's calls with short sentences. Rachel came by with takeout and sat in silence next to me, both of us pretending a rerun on TV was more important than everything unsaid between us. But it wasn't until Saturday afternoon, a full week after the rehearsal dinner, that something finally broke through the numbness. I was cleaning, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to feel like something in my life was still under my control. I pulled down the box of my mom's things again, double checking that the locket was safely inside now. It was. Then I found something I hadn't noticed before, a folded envelope tucked behind an old church program. On the front, in my mom's handwriting, it read, "For Jason, when you're lost." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No long speech, no life advice, just one line, written in her careful cursive. "You were never meant to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's version of love." I read it once, then again, then I sat down on the floor and cried. For the first time, they weren't angry tears, they weren't bitter, or even sad. They were released, like something had finally clicked into place. She saw this coming, somehow she knew. And in that moment, I realized something that hit harder than any insult Robert or Eleanor had ever thrown at me. I had been playing small, biting my tongue, laughing along, staying quiet, not because I was weak, but because I thought love required compromise. I thought maturity meant swallowing discomfort, but I was wrong. Love requires respect. And they had never given me that. Not Lydia, not her parents, not even once. That night, I sat down at my kitchen table with a notepad and started writing. Not a letter, not a journal, a plan. A plan for what came next. I made a list of everything I had given up over the past year. Friends I'd stopped calling, hobbies I'd abandoned, even job offers I'd turned down to stay close to Lydia's network. And then I made another list, the things I missed about myself. Weekend hikes, my woodshop projects, talking football with my dad, laughing at dumb movies with Rachel, and slowly something shifted. The grief was still there, but beneath it was something sturdier. Resolve. I started with small steps. I reached out to my old friend Marcus, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a year because Lydia thought he was too crude. We got lunch, laughed like no time had passed. I visited my dad and helped him fix up the back porch, just like we used to. Rachel and I took a spontaneous road trip to the mountains just to get out of town and scream into the wind. Piece by piece, I was rebuilding myself. But it wasn't just about going back to who I was. It was about becoming someone stronger. It's someone who could look in the mirror and not see shame, weakness, or regret, but pride. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected message popped into my inbox. It was from one of Lydia's cousins, Emily. She wrote, "I just wanted you to know what you did took guts. A lot of us were uncomfortable that night, but no one spoke up. Your mom sounded like an incredible woman. I'm sorry for how they treated her. You deserved better." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever, because it wasn't just validation. There's proof. Proof that I hadn't overreacted, that standing up for my mother wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the necessary thing. And from that moment on, I stopped looking back. I stopped checking Lydia's socials, stopped rereading her messages, stopped wondering what if. Because deep down I knew this wasn't a detour. This was the path, and I was finally walking it. 3 months passed. Winter settled in, crisp and sharp, as if the air itself was demanding clarity. And for the first time in a long while, I finally felt like I had it. I wasn't just healing, I was evolving. The version of myself that had sat quietly at that rehearsal dinner, swallowing insult after insult in the name of keeping the peace, was gone. Not dead, just buried beneath a stronger, clearer self who had learned the cost of silence. And I wasn't about to pay it again. I'd started a new side project in my garage, something I hadn't touched since college, custom woodwork. A neighbor had seen one of my shelves and asked if I could make something for his wife's birthday. Word spread. Orders trickled in. Before I knew it, I was booked out for weeks, building everything from handmade tables to heirloom boxes. Every piece I made felt like a piece of myself, carved, sanded, and smoothed back into shape. And then came the call that shifted everything. It was from Lydia's father's former business partner, Tom. We'd met briefly at a fundraiser. He was different from the rest. Quiet, grounded, the kind of guy who noticed the room instead of performing in it. Jason, he said, I heard what happened. I just wanted to say, I respect the hell out of you. I was silent for a second, unsure how to respond. He continued, listen, I'm opening a new property development firm, something small, tight-knit. I need someone who understands people and knows how to get things done. Your name came up. Are you interested in a meeting? I almost left. Lydia's father had spent years acting like I wasn't good enough. And now a man from his world was offering me a shot to lead something on my terms. I said yes, not because I wanted revenge, but because I was finally ready to take up space, without apology. We met, we clicked. 2 weeks later, I signed on as a partner in a boutique firm dedicated to sustainable housing, something I'd always been passionate about, but never had the freedom to pursue. And then fate handed me one final chance to close the loop. I got a message from an old high school friend, Kim. She worked in event photography and told me she'd been booked for a wedding. Lydia's wedding, not to me, obviously, but to someone else, some hedge fund manager from Connecticut. She looks different, Kim said gently, but not in a good way. I didn't ask for details, didn't need them. But later that night, I got curious. I looked up the venue, same one Robert and Eleanor had used for our rehearsal dinner, same overpriced, overpolished spectacle. I sat with that for a while. Then I got in my truck. No anger, no plan, just clarity. I parked across the street from the venue, far enough to stay invisible but close enough to see the marquee being hoisted above the entrance. His name, all lights, no substance. I didn't go inside, didn't crash it, I didn't make a scene. Instead, I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the building, not to remember her, but to remind myself how far I'd come. Because just a few months ago, I would have stood under those lights, smiling through pain, playing the role they wanted. Now I was free. On my way back, I stopped by my mom's grave. Snow dusted the top of her stone, soft and gentle. I sat with her for a while, told her about the business, about the shelves I'd made, about Rachel's promotion, about how Dad finally started seeing a physical therapist like she always wanted him to. And I told her thank you for the letter, for the lessons, for the strength I hadn't known I'd inherited until I had no choice but to use it. As I stood to leave, a gust of wind swept past me. I don't believe in signs, not usually, but in that moment I did. The wind, it felt like her hand on my shoulder, like approval, like pride. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold. Because when you've walked through fire and come out the other side, the wind doesn't chill you anymore. It wakes you up. I didn't think I'd ever hear from Lydia again, but life has a funny way of circling back, especially when pride gets bruised and egos crack under their weight. It started with a voicemail from Robert. Adakov, a voicemail. Jason, listen, I think we got off on the wrong foot that night. We were trying to be lighthearted. Maybe we crossed a line, but you walk out. Well, that was dramatic. We've all moved past it. Lydia's wedding didn't work out. Big surprise. So maybe it's time to put old wounds to rest. Let's have dinner. I played it twice just to be sure I wasn't hallucinating, then deleted it. But that wasn't the end of it. Eleanor sent a follow-up email dressing it in her usual velvet gloves. We would love to clear the air. Lydia has grown a lot these past few months. She's been in therapy. Maybe in another life. Another life indeed. I ignored it. But then, a week later, I ran into Lydia herself. Was at a local artisan market, one I had a booth at, showcasing my new custom furniture business. I was busy talking to a customer when I heard that voice behind me. Jason? I turned. She looked different, not broken, but dulled, like all the sparkle had been stripped away and replaced with something quieter, something unsure. I didn't know you'd be here, she said, awkwardly fidgeting with her bag. I run this booth, I said simply. She nodded, glancing at the table filled with hand-carved pieces. These are beautiful. You always had talent. I said nothing. She stepped closer. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything. I raised an eyebrow. Not just the rehearsal dinner, she added quickly, for not standing up for you, for laughing, for pretending like it wasn't a big deal. I thought I was keeping the peace, but really, I was just keeping appearances. I waited. She swallowed hard. I was scared of disappointing them, but in the end, I disappointed myself. And there it was. The admission I'd never thought I'd hear. For a second, I felt a flicker of something. Not affection, not longing, just closure. You hurt me, I said, calmly. But worse, you disrespected my mother. And you let people dishonor her memory while I sat there drowning in silence. I know, she whispered. And then you took from her. From me. She looked down. I was broken, she said. That's not an excuse, just the truth. I tried to move on, got engaged again. It didn't work. Because I was still trying to be someone I'm not. And who are you now? I asked, not mockingly, but with honest curiosity. She looked up. I don't know yet, she said, but I'd like to figure it out without hiding behind other people. I nodded. That's a good place to start. She looked like she wanted to ask for more. A chance, a conversation, anything. But she didn't. She just smiled, soft, sincere, and walked away. I watched her go. There was no anger left, no pain, just peace. But the universe wasn't done yet. A week later, I was invited to speak on a local podcast about entrepreneurship. Turns out my custom woodworking had caught more attention than I thought. We talked about building a brand, starting from scratch, and staying authentic. And near the end, the host asked, "What moment made you finally believe in yourself?" I paused, then answered, when I stood up in a room full of people and said enough, when I chose truth over tradition, and when I realized that protecting the memory of someone I love was worth more than pleasing anyone else. The episode went viral unexpectedly, and then the emails started coming from young men who had stayed silent at family dinners, from daughters who had let toxic relationships fester because they were afraid of confrontation, from strangers who said, "You helped me find my voice." That moment in the restaurant, that wasn't the climax. This was being able to turn something painful into power, being able to speak the truth without shaking, and watching the people who once dismissed me now sit quietly in the back row, listening because they finally realized I had something to say. Robert never sent another message. Eleanor unsubscribed from my newsletter. And Lydia? She sent one last email, short, simple. Thank you for holding up the mirror. I hope you keep doing that. For others, for yourself, I hit reply, then pause, and just close the browser because some things don't need answers. They just need to end. It's strange how the biggest moments in life don't always come with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive in silence, like a sunrise breaking through fog. It had been 6 months since I called off the wedding, 6 months since I stood up and finally said the one word that had changed everything. Enough. The weight I had carried for so long of silence, of self-betrayal, of trying to fit myself into spaces I didn't belong was gone. Not all at once, but piece by piece, like old armor finally shed after years of battle. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was mine again. My business was growing. I had 3 apprentices now, kids from working class backgrounds like mine, full of talent and grit. Every time I handed them a project, I thought of my mom, of the way she'd taken time for people others ignored. I was doing the same now, building something not just for myself, but for others. One of the apprentices, Malik, asked me once, "You ever regret walking away from that wedding?" I paused, then smiled. No, I regret staying as long as I did. Because the truth is, Lear wasn't the villain. Her parents weren't even the worst part. The real betrayal was how long I'd stayed quiet. How many insults did I let slide? How often I told myself, this is just how things are. But that's the thing about boundaries, you don't realize they've been crossed until you're already knee-deep in someone else's expectations. It took losing everything I thought I wanted to realize what I needed. I needed peace. I needed truth. I needed to remember who I was before I started performing for people who'd never applaud me sincerely. And in remembering that, I started living again. On the anniversary of my mom's passing, we held a small memorial, just me, Rachel, my dad, and a few close friends. We didn't do anything elaborate, just shared stories, lit candles, and laughed at the things she used to say. After everyone left, I stayed behind and sat next to her headstone. The locket was around my neck. "I wish you could see this," I whispered. "Not the success, not the revenge, but me, finally being me." A breeze moved through the trees. I swear I could smell her perfume in the air, lavender and warm linen. Before I left, I pressed a note into the grass beside her name. On it, I'd written the same line she'd once given me in her letter. "You were never meant to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's version of love." It's become my compass. Not just in relationships, but in every decision I make, every friendship I choose, every job I take, every truth I speak. I used to think closure meant hearing the right apology. Now I know closure is when you stop needing it. And forgiveness doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means setting down the weight you've been carrying and walking away lighter. Lydia and I haven't spoken since that email, and that's okay. Because some chapters don't need sequels. They just need to be honored and then closed. Now, when people ask me what changed my life, I don't say the breakup, the dinner, or even my mom's death. I say this, the moment I chose myself. And I hope whoever you are, wherever you are, when your moment comes, you'll choose yourself too.